Okay, everybody. So first of all, as you've been found at the beginning, we're remembering St. Paul of Thebes, who died in the year 341. He is honored as the first desert dweller and hermit. He did not, as Jamie put a whole lot of links on, he did not establish a single monastery, but soon after his end, there were many imitators of the life, and they filled the desert with monasteries. So part of the reflection is to remember that sometimes, while individual lives at the time seem they may not have a lot of consequence, afterwards they can often have a lot of consequence. Previously to that, people had sort of not really lived in the desert, that they'd gone. And we have to remember, when we use the term desert fathers, it often starts with people who went to the edge of civilization, the known civilization. So they weren't really in a desert as we understand it. And certainly the deserts around Egypt are very different to the deserts of Australia. So we have to use, when we think of desert, we have to use it carefully. But he was remembered as that first desert dweller and hermit. You can read about St. Anthony, who visited him, and he also moved into the desert. He moved into an area that was an abandoned fort for about 2 decades. And just briefly to end on that a note, Satan's last stronghold is the desert. When Jesus goes in to be tempted, he goes into the desert. And Karl Rahner said, the Christian of the future will be a mystic or won't exist at all. So there's just some thoughts about Paul Thebes as we remember him today, as we now take some of that information into reflecting on the 2 readings. I asked you to try and work out what was my background. Does the first reading give you some hint on what my background is? Paul shaking his head. It's a painting of the Valley of the Dry Bones. Well done, Jamie. So there's a lot of paintings of the Valley of the Dry Bones in Christian art, and a lot of them have skeletons. Well, when you read the verse carefully, it says the bones are scattered. So any sort of bringing back to life is not a corpse, like maybe we'll get to Lazarus in a minute. It's not a skeleton. They are literally bones scattered in the desert. Absolutely no life whatsoever. So the raising of the bones in Ezekiel is quite different to that of Lazarus. And the question that was put to Ezekiel, and in one sense to Mary in John's Gospel, is, can there be life again? Now, there's no direct answer given to that question in Ezekiel. That's asked of Ezekiel. And what we have is knowledge and experience of God. So some of you might remember that sort of song, the knee bones connected to the thigh bone and all that. Well, that comes from this passage of the Valley of the Dry Bones, the clicking of the bones as they start to come together. I wonder if you were Ezekiel and you were told to prophesy to a valley of dry bones, this literal scattering of bones, would you have done it? If you've been asked to say, bring life into this absolutely, what seems to be absolutely death and dryness with no possibility of life, would you have been Ezekiel and prophesied to those dry bones? We believe the passage is written to describe the experience of what happened after the fall of Jerusalem. So if you know your Old Testament, Jerusalem's been captured. The leaders have been taken off into Babylon. people are left behind, and there's going to be a real tension 40, 50 years later between those who have been left behind, in one sense kept the faith very differently, to those who got carted off to Jerusalem and then decided to carted off to Babylon and then decided to come back. So here the passage seems to be describing and saying to the people in Babylon, it seems as if there is nothing left of your faith, absolutely nothing. Now you've been carted off. Now you're living in Babylon. It seems just like you are in that valley of dry bones with no possible sign of life. And yet, somehow, life is going to be breathed back into your situation. So a bit like Paul of Thebes, who ran off into the desert fearing for his life, thinking there was no possibility. A bit like Mary and Martha we'll hear about, when there was no possibility of a renewal of life. Here is a new possibility that comes in. And you could compare that breath of life to what happens at the very beginning of Genesis, when breath is breathed over, ruach, breathed over the creation to bring creation to life. So it's a bit like that, from out of the darkness, out of the no possibility of life, comes a new possibility of life. And ultimately, Ezekiel is talking about a new kingdom, a united kingdom that's going to require an exodus even greater than the first exodus. And that first exodus was well remembered and honored among the Jewish people. But now we're going to need a new exodus, something even greater. People have to come from all over the place. And you might think your experience of holy hermits, people coming from all over the place, meeting together, forming a community. And so we have this, what's it going to be like? Can this new exodus, this new life be possible? And the Lord will bring his people from many countries. And we compare that to Isaiah. And Ezekiel's activity suggests that the divine activity has to be incarnate. Life is breathed back into the bones to give a real body. So when we get to the incarnation of Jesus, there is hints here about God is not one who just works sort of supernaturally, but through the very existence of people, the incarnation. And finally, a lesson from that might be that a divided Israel can never truly be Israel until it all comes back together. And if we think that into today, maybe a message also for us is a divided Christianity can never be a true Christianity until we come back and unite together in one way. Some people have said that this is the highlight of Ezekiel's proclamation, and indeed it's probably a message that sums up the Old Testament. As you know, the Old Testament is 39 very disparate books that have put together. And when the books together of all these different authors are put together, to give them a meaning is very difficult. But ultimately, this passage from Ezekiel could say, to be summing up, to say, it is about the new hope that comes after many trials and people having to unite again together to be the true people of God. So that's a message in Ezekiel, and it might be a good summary of the Old Testament. So you've seen that background. Let me give you another background to me. Can I give you this one? This one might be Let me do that one. Okay, how do I get out of here? Yeah, done that. Yeah. Okay. Now, any guesses what this background to me is? Well, we're looking at the passage of and well done on the gospel reader, because this is probably the longest gospel passage ever read at church on a Sunday. Yes, someone has put up Mary at the tomb, and there's a couple other people there besides Mary as well. I'd like you to focus. Oh, I'll come to that in a minute. So this is a Rembrandt drawing of the raising of Lazarus. Okay. So, and it's interesting, if you were going to be a painter, if you're a painter and are going to paint one image from this long chapter of the raising of Lazarus, which part of the scene would you pick? Would you pick Jesus with his disciples arguing about whether he's dead or asleep? Would you pick when he first met Martha? Would you pick when Martha is talking to Mary and Mary races up and goes to Jesus? Would you pick Mary crying at his feet saying, if only you were here? Would you pick Jesus going to the tomb? Would you show Lazarus at all? Now, Lazarus doesn't get much of a mention in this story, and I'll come to that. So, from whose perspective do you understand this story? Perhaps your first inclination is to think of Jesus, or to be Mary, or to be Martha. But do you read this story from the perspective of Lazarus? Okay. Now, there's a Lenten study book recommended by the Cathedral, The Imaginary Doorway, Stories and Studies from the Gospel of Inclusion. If any of you have that book or have been participating in those studies, you'll see their imaginative retelling of some of the gospel passages. The three I've read so far have been about the woman caught in adultery, the healing of the demoniac, the Gerasenes, and the men who carried the stretcher, who let their friend down through the roof to be healed by Jesus. So let us take a perspective of this story as from Lazarus. So here's I see somebody said I paint them taking the strips of cloth off of Lazarus. Oh yeah, okay. Well, no, you can put up in the chat where you take your perspective from. Now, as I said, let's take it from the view of Lazarus. Lazarus is going to tell this story, not an outside observer. Lazarus might say, gee, I haven't been feeling too well recently. I'm actually quite sick. And Mary and Martha are looking after him. And Lazarus realizes he is dying. And Mary and Martha say to their brother, let's send for Jesus. And Lazarus says, don't bother. I don't think that's going to help. Lazarus dies. He comes to the end of his life as he knows it, and he dies. And then he says, the next thing I remember is finding myself being lifted out of the tomb and people unbinding me. Then they all went away, and I went back to my sister's house, and I don't wish to tell anyone else the story. Because we hear nothing about Lazarus. Lazarus never speaks. We know he goes back to his sister's place, and there's nothing else. Then he's there when Mary pours the oil on Jesus' feet, and he is never mentioned again within the Bible. And I find that strange. Don't know about you, but I find it strange. Lazarus is never mentioned again. Oh, by the way, I'm going to give you a different background now, another way of seeing the story. That's a bit different, this one. If I move out the way, go this way, you can see that background picture. And what do you think of that background picture? Do you know, any idea who painted that one? Put up in the chat if you think you know who painted that one. The colors might give it away. Van Gogh it is. So here's Van Gogh, and Van Gogh paints Lazarus, and you can see the face of Lazarus, and the two sisters are there, and they're dressed in clothes of two women in Van Gogh's life at the time he painted his painting, and the sun is symbolic of Jesus. So very different to Van Gogh. Similar scene. Oops, sorry. Got things falling over here. Very different to Van Gogh with a much to Rembrandt with the much darker colors, the very vibrant light of Van Gogh, the bright colors, the south of France, and the face on Lazarus, the surprised look that he has. So, the miracles of Jesus are very seldom used as ways to try and convince people that of who Jesus is. They're often more to deal with people's situation. The proclamation of Jesus to the disciples that, you know, this seems to be in a way in which I can do something to show the glory of God, is not repeated when he comes to the grave and meets the two sisters and notes their distress. They had the firm belief he should have come earlier. They sort of tell him, why didn't you come earlier? You've helped all the other people with the healings. Why couldn't you have come earlier and saved our brother's life? And Jesus responds very carefully to those questions about, do you believe? And not very often people say Jesus is the Messiah, but Mary does. So from the Lazarus viewpoint, the story is never used in the Bible, might be used by other people, but this story is never used as a proof for God. Even, you know, there's sort of a very vague mention to him of when he's in Holy Week, but this is not meant as, look what I can do to Lazarus, I will rise again. He doesn't use that when he tells his disciples about rising on the 3 days. There's some detail in the history of the church about Lazarus, and anything in that far back is sort of, when may or may not be accurate. There's a couple of different traditions of what happened to Lazarus. One tradition that holds after the ascension, Lazarus and his sisters moved to Cyprus, where Lazarus became the bishop of Kition and died in about AD 63. And there's another theory that claims that Lazarus and his sisters moved to Gaul, France, southern France to preach the gospel, and Lazarus became the Bishop of Marseille, and he was beheaded under the tyranny of the Emperor Domitian. If you're in France, the site of the three Marys is a very, Mary and Mary Magdalene, there's a great tradition of them being in that southern part of France. It's a tradition that's well held by those of the Catholic faith, but there's no proof one way or the other of that. But it does say something about people wanting to remember Lazarus and remember Mary and Martha and Mary Magdalene. So here's a story that talks about absolute loss, no chance of life, absolute grief, and yet somehow, just like the Valley of the Dry Bones, new life is breathed into this to give to people comfort when the sadness, Jesus comes with comfort to a situation that seems impossible, and yet something happens. And yet it's taken to be just the comfort for those people, never a proof to say, look how great I am, I can bring people back to life. So what might this say to us as we come close to Holy Week? The church in its sacraments, the church in its life of being with people, of proclaiming its ministry and just using its ministry to speak for itself, rather than saying, look how great we are. Just like the Valley of the Dry Bones, people coming from all over to be the church. And how might this be working out in your lives and in the lives of holy hermits, of a community that's been formed out of what seemed hopeless situations, and also how do we see this meeting of people helping us in our times when things don't seem so good, as we've had in those prayers already this morning. So I leave those stories with you, perhaps giving you a different way to think on these traditional stories that are told at Easter time, and pondering on the mystery of Lazarus and the silence that ensued after his resurrection. Brought back to life, not a resurrection, a coming back to life. Jesus. Hard to describe what actually it was with Lazarus, but anyway, the Lord be with you.